All right, so we have a great question from Akriti Matu on Quora.com. Her question is, what is the Hasidic community? I made another video trying to answer this, and I'm a guy who likes to ramble on a lot, so I can't guarantee that I'll be able to keep this one short, but I'm gonna try. But you can watch another video if you just want to hear me rambling. So the Hasidic community is is actually not one community, but it's a type of community, or it's a movement within the Jewish community. It's a religious movement that started in the 1730s, and by the 1800s became the dominant Jewish movement in most of Eastern Europe. It was very controversial when it began, but it eventually became, first mainstream and eventually old guard and old fashioned. So it's fascinating how religion works like that. And it's not only with us, it happens everywhere. How something that was radical when it started becomes very traditional over time. And I think that speaks about, human nature and so many things. But again, I've got to try to answer the question. So, the vast majority of scholars understand the Hasidic movement as beginning, like I said, in the 1730s, around between the borders of what would be present-day Poland and Ukraine, with a singular individual, Israel, the son of Eliezer, who is known as the Baal Shem Tov. He was the first Hasidic rabbi according to most understandings, although some would say that the movement really could have its roots earlier. There certainly were, according to Hasidic lore, secret groups that existed before this revelation, and in a certain sense, a lot of Hasidic philosophy certainly has its roots both in Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism, but also in the philosophy of my ancestor, Rabbi Judah Loew, the Maharal of Prague. So there are connections between these. But as far as what's the form that we understand it now, let's discuss a little bit. First of all, what is this word Hasidic? Where does it come from? The fact was that, and I'm not sure when it entered into the English lexicon the way that we have it, that we speak of Hasidic Judaism. The term Hasid, which is rooted in the word Chesed. Chesed means kindness, and a Hasid is someone, generally is translated as someone who practices an extra level of piety. Sometimes it's a word that Hasidim appears in the Bible, especially in the Psalms. This word, Hasidav, Hasidim. I know Birnbaum, would translate, Philip Birnbaum, he translates it as pious or faithful followers, which harkens more to like the Hasidic movement that we have today, and I don't think that's really accurate in a biblical sense, in a liturgical sense, in any sense. You could say it was often translated as saints, but it's there's a whole history of other movements that were known as Hasidim, both just a type of person, individuals known as Hasidim, but actual movements, political movements, religious movements that are not related to the modern Hasidic movement. But for example, the word you might find in some non-Jewish Bibles, particularly the Catholic Bibles, have the books of the Maccabees, and there was a group, the Hasidians is how it's often transliterated when coming from the Greek text, but in Hebrew they would be called Hasidim, but it has nothing to do with the modern Hasidic movement. I've even seen, we have an idea of pious, righteous Gentiles. Some people I've seen that, and they call Hasidei Umos HaOlam, the pious ones among the nations of the world. And I've seen some people, somewhat ironically, I'm not sure, refer to the current Noahide movement as Hasidic Gentiles because they're Hasidei Umos HaOlam, which is a strange appellation and not really accurate, but it sounds kind of cool. Like, I like the way it sounds, but it's not a proper usage, although if people want to call themselves that. Certainly you do have, even among these groups, those who embrace the Hasidic movement of the Baal Shem Tov in the Noahide movement. So it's not particularly only for Jews necessarily, the Hasidic movement of the Baal Shem Tov, although it is rooted in Judaism, and generally, particularly outside of one particular community, it's almost totally Jewish, meaning with the exception of Chabad Lubavitch, which has a strong Noahide movement. In other Hasidic communities, if you're drawn to a devotion to a Hasidic community, you are probably going to convert to Judaism first before you identify as Hasidic, as opposed to in Chabad Lubavitch, they're not as welcoming of converts as other Hasidic communities are. They do welcome converts, but not as readily as other communities do. And so it's going to be more likely that someone will not convert to Judaism, be what we might call a Noahide, and still have some devotion to that particular Hasidic community. And so, like I said, the Hasidic, it's not one Hasidic community, but many Hasidic communities. It's a philosophy, it's a way of life, and really there's not one monolithic Hasidic community, but there are many different Hasidic communities throughout the world. And then there are people who might not actually be part of any particular Hasidic community, but still embrace Hasidic philosophy very strongly. And generally it's understood to be part of the Orthodox approach to Judaism. However, when you get to the philosophical aspects of Hasidism, they have a strong influence outside of Orthodoxy as well, and you'll have what you might call neo-Hasidic approach and other things. I've already spoken for 9 minutes and really haven't answered the question. So when we speak of the Hasidic community, though, again, we're speaking generally of those who follow the teachings of Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov means the master of the good name, and his disciples, and the disciples of his disciples to this day. And eventually what developed in these communities is a sort of a dynastic leadership, where generally many of these communities, how it developed, they'll pass the leadership of the community from father to son. Now, there's a lot of interesting contradictions within the Hasidic community, because it's, in one way, it was a radical movement, almost a New Age movement, so to speak, and on the other hand, today it's understood to be the ultra-Orthodox right-wing conservative movement, or one of the right-wing conservative movements in Judaism, which confuses a lot of people. So let's talk a little bit about what this is all about, what the history is, and what the philosophy is and the ideology. So so again, generally it's understood to be, that the Hasidim, they didn't traditionally call themselves Hasidim. In a certain sense, I think some people, insulted them by calling them Hasidim, and then that became like, oh, that's our word, meaning they were calling them, ironically calling them Hasidim, and then they claimed the word for themselves, now that's our word, and now it's totally acceptable. There's nothing offensive to call someone Hasidic. It's not even that we can use that word and you can't use it at this point. And it's already been like that for 200 years, so it's not, there's nothing, they call them, they call the movement Hasidic Judaism, Hasidus. They call the study of the, of this philosophy, Hasidus, Hasidut, Hasidus. And so that's just something to have in mind. It's a philosophy that focuses on, certainly in the mainstream Orthodox approaches to Hasidic Judaism, total devotion to orthodoxy and orthopraxy in Judaism, although some practices might be slightly different. There are for the most part, the Hasidic practices will be more strict than other approaches to Judaism, but there are cases where they're going to be less strict. And certain people will question, well, why do you even have to do this, and so forth. And to the point where even to this day there are some people who pretty much want to consider the Hasidic movement to be heretical or outside of normative Judaism, but it's become so well accepted that that's the opposition to the Hasidic movement is almost non-existent in our day and age, the way that it was when the movement began. People still might find it to be a little out of the ordinary or exotic, or but it's essentially, it is what it is. It's generally accepted today. Not that there's no controversy, but it's generally accepted. But the main ideas of the Hasidic movement are emotional approach to God, embracing God through emotion, something that it's not pantheism, but it's a level of monotheism that would seem to many other monotheists to seem to be pantheist. Also, the idea of providence and in certain philosophies, predetermination comes in. But the main focuses will be joy, faith, and love. The Baal Shem Tov didn't really write very much that we have. We have one letter that he wrote to his brother-in-law. Other than that, we have almost nothing in writing from him. However, from his students and his students' students and his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, we have a wide written canon, but also even from the Baal Shem Tov himself and his students and so forth, and his students' students, his disciples and his disciples' disciples, and his grandchildren and so forth. We have a tremendous oral tradition that slowly but surely is being has been committed to writing and been published, but I'm sure there's still plenty that was never published that still exists in oral tradition, and plenty that's been lost in this tradition. But there are certain teachings that have been attributed to the Baal Shem Tov. One, for example, is that instead of fasting more than is required by law, although of course whatever's required by law is required by law, but as far as many people as an act of piety and penance would fast above and beyond what's required, the Baal Shem Tov said instead of fasting we should focus on three great loves, and that's the love of God, the love of God's Word, and the love of God's people. And that focusing on these loves it accomplishes more than fasting for thousands of days. And so, like I said, the expressions of spirituality in the Hasidic movement are very emotional. And so whereas in other communities the prayer liturgy has tremendous decorum and is very serious and somber, the Hasidic approach to prayer, although it varies from one community to another, will generally be more intense, meditative, and joyous. Depends on the community. Some communities sing a lot. Some communities will scream every word of the liturgy. Some communities will whisper very quietly, but slowly. Each community has its own approach, or they might have a tune that they recite the liturgy to, and so forth. There are certain aspects of Hasidic practice that are considered peculiar to the Hasidic community, although they have been to a certain extent adopted elsewhere. A major aspect of Judaism, of Jewish community life, is the Mikvah, and particularly that a married woman, after she has her period, has to count 7 clean days. Let's say the period lasts 5 days or so, 7 clean days, and then she immerses in the mikveh, and from the time she has the period until she immerses in the mikveh, the husband and wife are not allowed to touch. And then after that, they go back to regular married life. Now, the mikveh is also used for other reasons in Jewish law. A convert to Judaism has to immerse in the mikveh, almost like how in the Christian tradition there's baptism, and that's actually the roots of the Christian tradition of baptism is in the Jewish mikveh. And also when we have new dishes, we'll put the dishes in the mikveh. There's a commandment to do that. We find in the book of Numbers to put the dishes in the water. But then the question is, what about when do men immerse in the mikveh? And in most Orthodox Jewish communities, before the holidays, they certainly will. Some will go before the Sabbath. But in the Hasidic community, although it's spread to other communities as well, particularly many in the Sephardic communities, in the Middle Eastern communities, and some others, will immerse daily in the mikveh as a religious devotion. Some men don't even go before Yom Kippur, but just, it's a part of our religious devotion, is immersing in the mikveh. For the men to go every day. And that's something, it seemed it did exist before the Hasidic movement, but the Hasidic movement really turned it into, I would say, almost an institution. So for that reason, whereas the non-Hasidic Orthodox Jewish communities and some other Jewish communities will have a mikveh, one mikveh in the community, and if men maybe want to use it, they'll use it in the daytime, the women use it at night, but it's not really that much use. Whereas in the Hasidic community, you might have, every synagogue might have a mikveh. You might have several mikvahs, even on the same block in some places in Brooklyn or other parts of neighborhoods in Israel and so forth, or even other countries as well. I'm passing by Curious Joel right now. Plenty of men's mikvahs. Not, maybe there's 3 or 4 women's mikvahs in Curious Joel, and there's probably at least 10 or 15 or 20 men's mikvahs, if not more. As the Hasidic community spread, so when the Baal Shem Tov passed away, the leadership of the movement was passed on mainly to his disciple Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezrich, although there were other disciples of the Baal Shem Tov who were also very prominent. And then from there, the movement spread to especially the preacher of Mezrich, Rabbi Dov Ber, the Mezricher Maggid, had many, many disciples, and almost all of them became rebbes, sometimes called grand rabbis in their own right. In German, they would call them often Wunderrabbiners, wonder rabbis, because they were often attributed to be miracle workers. This guy was going over there anyway. So these rabbis spread all throughout, from the Baal Shem Tov was Mezhebush in Ukraine, and the Mezricher Maggid was in Mezrich, and from his disciples spread throughout Europe. So you had Hasidic rabbis, particularly throughout Poland, Ukraine, going into Russia, even parts of Lithuania, even though most of the opposition to the Hasidic community was in Lithuania. There were 1 or 2 in Germany and in what's currently the Czech Republic. Didn't really take off in those places. And eventually to Hungary. So you had Hungary, Romania. So, but much of the well-known Eastern European countries, Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, and different parts of Poland, particularly, there's a difference between the High Poland and Galicia. And so you had these different, courts, Hasidic courts, where the Rebbe was almost like a king over his court. And you might even have a court jester and so forth, and these types of things. And you would go into a Rebbe for a blessing, for advice, and also he would hold court publicly. They would call it tish, a table, where generally he'd be eating his dinner, eating a meal, but he'd share the food with those present, and that's considered a blessing, almost similar to how in many Christian churches they'll have communion, but this is not just a little bit of wine and a wafer. This will be some fish, some souffle, some fruit, in addition to the bread and the wine. And all of these different foods would be blessed, and not in the sense of communion how Christians understand it, but more or less in the sense of, first of all, there's a mystical understanding that, just how Christians have a mystical understanding of their communion, of their Eucharist, but it's a different type of mystical understanding. It's more or less a way for the community also to be united in a certain sense around their leadership and but also devotion to God. But there's beliefs there of what the movement represents and so forth. And if you're going to eat this food, there's this blessing or that blessing that comes into your life. It's a meditative practice and so forth, eating the foods. 27 minutes. Other aspects of the Hasidic community that became, well marked is their distinctive garb. I mean, you see me, I have a hat and a kaftan, and each community will generally have their fashion, their style that they wear to demonstrate that they belong to a community. With that being said, not everybody who wears a black hat is necessarily part of a Hasidic community. You do have ultra-Orthodox and even some modern Orthodox who wear the black hats who are non-Hasidic, but traditional ultra-Orthodox, particularly, with the lifestyle and culture that has a lot of its origins in Lithuania by those who oppose the Hasidic community, but still have much in common with them. I mean, the basic aspects of Jewish devotion and religious life are the same. So a Hasidic Jew can generally pray in a non-Hasidic Orthodox synagogue, generally, without any issue. And often you'll have such a thing. You'll have, synagogues where you have that diversity of Jews of different backgrounds and different cultures, but even though the liturgy, the Hasidic liturgy, is slightly different than other approaches to liturgy, the basic structure is the same. So generally, if you go to a non-Hasidic synagogue, they'll have at least one or two Hasidic prayer books. So, if someone wants to follow a different liturgy than the synagogue is using, as long as, they can't lead the prayer using that, and the same thing, but if a Hasidic Jew is going to lead the prayer in a non-Hasidic synagogue, they will fulfill their obligation of prayer using the non-Hasidic liturgy, because it's totally fine whichever version of liturgy one uses, as long as it's a traditional form of the liturgy. We do now, Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, and even conservative to a certain point, Reform Judaism has this as part of their tradition as well. But we have a set liturgy, and in Orthodox Judaism, for sure, it's seen as an obligation to recite this liturgy on a daily basis 3 times a day. And that is the same whether one is modern Orthodox, like Jared Kushner, has no beard and doesn't even wear a yarmulke when he's not praying. But the interesting thing about Jared Kushner is, in Washington, D.C., he attends a Hasidic synagogue. And as far as Hasidism being the different types. So, like I said, it's spread throughout Europe, and in different countries often took on different ways. But even in the same country, even, I mentioned one community where they might scream everything, and one community where they might whisper everything. Those 2 communities were both in the same general area geographically. In Russia, near Lithuania actually, and they, actually in Lithuania, and they developed into communities that exist to this day and maintain their traditions to this day. So it's fascinating how this is, in different communities. So you're gonna have, several well-known communities and dozens and dozens of small, if not hundreds, of small, either grand rabbis or communities. Some grand rabbis without a community. But maybe a small synagogue, and maybe not even that, The big communities have their own histories, as do the small communities. I can think of 6 communities that I would mention as large communities, although there are other large communities. I'm not really seeking to exclude anybody by saying this, but we'll talk about 3 that are particularly big in America and 3 that are particularly big in Israel. I think that's what I'm going to discuss at this point, even though all of these exist both in America and in Israel, as well as having branches in, Belgium and in Australia, perhaps, and in the UK, maybe even South America to a certain extent. So the 3 that are very large in America that we can discuss, although there are others, maybe we might mention some others. You have 2 communities that are almost polar opposites in a wide variety of ways. Are the Lubavitch community, which were rooted in Russia, Chabad Lubavitch. Lubavitch was a town in Russia, and the Satmar community, which was rooted in Hungary. And both these communities are, have large presence in Brooklyn, and essentially, the Chabad Lubavitch community is centered in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and the Satmar community is essentially centered in Williamsburg, neighborhood of Brooklyn, with a large satellite community in upstate New York, particularly in Orange County, in the town of Palm Tree, in the village of Curious Joel. Now, these two communities are both Hasidic communities, but they are almost polar opposites in every way. And it's fascinating how different they are. The most obvious way is their dress, Chabad, and their other style, hairstyle, and so forth. The Chabad Lubavitch community dress essentially in what's a more modern style. They wear a fedora hat, bend-down hat, usually a short jacket, at least during the week. On the Sabbath, they'll wear like a Prince Albert frock coat, which they call a kapota, or a sirtuk. Sometimes they'll have those made out of silk, so they can be expensive. So it's funny. So they'll have often a not so expensive hat with a very expensive coat on the Sabbath. They don't have long payas the way almost all other Hasidic communities are famous for the curls, like I have, but I keep them behind my ears usually. The Chabad Lubavitch, they don't have that, beyond the basic requirement of the letter of the law. The belts that are worn for prayer are only worn after marriage in the Chabad community, whereas other communities wear them, from bar mitzvah on. Although they make a big deal about wearing them after they're married, a bigger deal than some other groups make. They do have long beards, as other communities do, and that's a big focus in their community. One of the ironies is that it's one of the oldest Hasidic movements, and yet they are very modern, and in many ways. They almost all speak the language of their country. They'll speak English in America, and they'll speak Hebrew in Israel, and so forth, and French in France, and wherever else, and Spanish in South America, wherever they live, they speak the language of the land, and they're very much a missionary movement. They send rabbis out all over the world to establish synagogues and community centers for outreach missionary work. Their mission is mostly to Jews. They do not welcome converts very much. If someone converts outside of their community, they will accept them, but they very rarely will do conversions themselves. But rather they encourage people who are not Jewish, who are interested in their movement or whatever, to keep the 7 Noahide laws. And they have an extreme devotion to their rabbis that some people would almost consider cult-like. They'll say that all Hasidim have this devotion, but it's not really true. Not the level of devotion that they have, to the point where a significant fraction of the community, it's hard to measure whether it's a majority or a minority, in some shape or form believe that their late leader, who was the last leader of their movement, they didn't replace him when he passed away, that he was the Messiah. or some kind of a messianic figure. He definitely spoke a lot about the coming of the Messiah. That was a big thing that he was focused on. And otherwise a very high level of devotion to their rabbi. Other things that are different in other Hasidic communities, their liturgy is radically different than others. There's a Kabbalistic formula, L'Shem Yichud, that most other Hasidim will recite before any devotion, whereas they will only recite it one particular part of the liturgy. They don't have hymns that other traditional hymns that other Hasidic communities have, but rather they'll just have wordless tunes or tunes with, one verse from Psalms or something like that they might repeat over and over again, which other communities have as well. But they only have one hymn at every Sabbath meal, whereas the other Hasidic communities, each Sabbath meal is a different hymn, and it's the same hymn as recited in other Hasidic communities. But the other communities will have a large library of hymns that is not part of their tradition in Chabad, to the point where, again, Chabad, they'll say, well, Hasidim don't recite hymns, and it's not true, meaning Chabad Hasidim don't, but the others do. And many other similar things, and in almost every way that you can describe here, Satmar is the opposite. Satmar is one of the newer Hasidic movements. It's probably the biggest, unless Chabad, they like to include people who pray at Chabad synagogues who may not have beards, who might not even be observant at all. If they include that, then Chabad would be the biggest movement. But it's not comparing apples and oranges. If you want to compare Reform Judaism and Chabad, then Chabad perhaps now has overtaken to a certain extent Reform, and at least in the number of synagogues, if not the number of attendees of Reform or conservative and so forth. It's certainly a competition there with their community synagogues that they have with their more missionary type work outside of the Hasidic community. Satmar, they don't do that type of stuff. They're not looking, even though they do, they're friendly and interestingly, it's much more likely, it's to a certain extent easier to convert to Judaism in Satmar than it is in Lubavitch. It's much harder for someone who was born Jewish, who is not part of the Satmar community, to really fit in there, but to convert and be accepted as a convert and warmly welcomed. So that's another opposite. So the form of dress in Satmar is going to be the more old-fashioned form. The devotions to the Rebbe are minimal. The Rebbe is almost more like a figurehead, like the Queen of England in Satmar, whereas there's a lot of pomp and circumstance. And so whereas the Lubavitcher Rebbe dressed very simply, with a fedora hat and a short jacket and necktie and long pants, and the Rebbes of Satmar will wear, silk or polyester kaftans and short, knicker pants, with long white socks, whereas the Hasidim will only wear the white socks on the Sabbath, if they do. Some wear long pants on the Sabbath, but the Rebbe wears white socks every day. That's a sign of him being the Rebbe. He carries a silver-tipped cane. He wears a fur coat, although His son, if he serves as a chief rabbi in the community, will also wear a fur coat. On the Sabbath, the Rebbe will wear, a white robe, a white kaftan, and on other holidays might wear different colored kaftans. The hat during the week is similar to mine, but flat and wide, but lower. And on the Sabbath, a fur hat, the strimal. So, like I said, in Chabad they'll have the expensive coat and the less expensive hat, and in Satmar the coat usually is not that expensive what the Hasidim wear, and it's usually polyester, but the hat is going to be quite valuable, quite expensive. They prefer not to speak the language of the country where they live. They prefer to speak in Yiddish. However, in Hungary, they did speak Hungarian, although the Satmar Rebbe was not happy with that, really, but it was part of the culture that was there. And so, although they will speak English, perhaps a broken English, but among themselves they'll speak Yiddish. They don't have a missionary program, although they welcome guests and visitors as long as they're respectful and they're not trying to do some damage. Also, there's not a real strong focus on Hasidic philosophy in Satmar. It's a part of their more holistic approach, but there is a rich liturgy of hymns and other liturgical poetry and so forth that is classical Ashkenazic, European traditions. A lot of those traditions come from Germany and came to Hungary, and these traditions are very, very important to the Satmar community. They do have the long payas, traditional clothes, everything. And so in almost every aspect, whatever it is one way in Chabad, it's the exact opposite in Satmar. I personally find the Satmar approach much more appealing. I find it to be more down to earth, more practical, personally. And I send my children to Satmar schools, but my family from Europe came from Satmar, but they were not Satmar Hasidim. The whole, and to a certain extent, Satmar doesn't really see it. Although we talk of Satmar Hasidim, it's almost in an ironic sense. It's not a major focus of Hasidism. However, as we mentioned, the Hasidic liturgy, the going to the Mikvah every day, these things are very important in the Satmar community, and the community comes really before the Rebbe in Satmar. Whereas in Lubavitch, I would say the Rebbe comes first. In Satmar, the community comes first, and the Torah comes before the community, and God comes before everything. Which, that's the same everywhere, I'll say, I guess. But some people might argue otherwise. The other communities in America, you have the Bobov community in Borough Park, which is very similar to the Satmar community, but not as extreme, I guess. Satmar and Bobov, one thing they have in common is that they encourage their adherents to go work for a living. Bobov, they're going to be more likely to speak English well. They're going to have more of a secular education than Satmar or Lubavitch. Lubavitch has no secular education. Satmar has a very basic meets the basic requirements of the state. They're very well politically connected. Quite often politicians will go to have audience with the grand rabbis of Satmar for a photo opportunity and so forth, as they do to other rebbes as well. Like I said, Bobov, that's in Borough Park section of Brooklyn, big community, came from Galicia. Then you have also in America, I guess we can mention New Square, coming from Ukraine. In New Square, you have a little, since also Ukraine and Russia both, there is that more of a devotion to the Rebbe. Although, so the one thing they're going to be more similar to Chabad is a stronger devotion to the Rebbe that, again, some people might even consider to be cult-like. But otherwise, they're extremely traditional, and in some ways even more traditional than the Satmar, and also more homogeneous. Satmar, another thing about Satmar is that you have many different styles of clothing. You do have Satmar Hasidim with short jackets. You do have different hat styles. Different question: do you wear white socks on Sabbath? Yes or no? Do you wear black socks with knickers during the week? Yes or no? Things like that. In Israel, as I mentioned, we'll mention 3 or 4 big communities. Although Satmar and Bobov and Lubavitch and New Square all have communities in Israel as well. Satmar is against the existence of the state of Israel and the existence of any Jewish state, religious or secular. Whereas officially a lot of the other communities feel that as well, but in Satmar that's a major point. And so in Satmar, the ones who live in Israel, they don't take any government funding for any of their programs. They don't go to the Western Wall. They don't speak Hebrew. They don't use Israeli money. They try to avoid even being Israeli citizens as much as possible. What else? With they don't vote, so forth. In Israel, we can mention a few communities. Breslov is a community that hasn't had a Rebbe in 200 years or so. It's about 200 years. But they have teachers and leaders in the community, but not an official Rebbe. They have a lot of, like Lubavitch, they have a lot of newcomers, a lot of people who were not brought up religious who joined that community. But Breslov is radically welcoming of converts, and that goes back to the beginning of the Breslov community, of the movement, where Rabbi Nachman said that a major aspect of his theology is to make converts, and to welcome converts. And he said that was a major thing that Moses was involved with. Oh my goodness. What else do we have in Israel? And they're almost like a hippie movement. They're dancing around and in the streets. And there's many different types of Breslov though, and they make their pilgrimage to Ukraine every year on Rosh Hashanah, to the grave of Rabbi Nachman, who he was a charismatic young rabbi. He passed away in his 30s. And he started that movement. The other big movements in Israel are the Gerach Hasidim from Poland. They dress a little bit different than everybody else, and their prayers are very quick. They speak Hebrew. You have the Belzer Hasidim from Galicia, and you have you can mention the Kloisenberger Hasidim, who are very close geographically to Satmar, but ideologically have a lot of differences, even though they were related to each other, but also more closely related to Babov. I'm out of memory now, so I'll have to stop. Thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment, and we'll see you later.